Achtung, Achtung, welcome to We Have Ways of Making You Talk with me, Al Murray and James Holland. And we're very lucky, sweltering here in where I am in London right now. But we're joined by someone from far away, Jim. Who have we got today?
Well, I'm really pleased about this one. We've been trying to get Erri Hotta on for a long time, and that it's taken this long is entirely our fault, not Erri's, it has to be said. He responded very warmly and enthusiastically to my first entreaty, and then we kind of sort of one date passed and nothing happened, and then another, and then another. But anyway, we're finally here. And Erri is the author of a book called Japan 1941, Countdown to Infamy. And Al, you read this first,
yeah.
and then put me onto it, and it's just such a fascinating book, because I think it's the first time that anyone has properly gone into why did Japan go to war, because there's on so many levels it just makes absolutely no sense at all. And people have dealt with this subject, and of course it's been written about in the past, but not in this kind of very, very intricate detail and looking at all the different personalities. And it's the countdown to war, but it's the countdown to war that we've never had before this book came out. And it's just fascinating. So Erri, you are extremely welcome, and thank you for coming on.
Thank you for having me. So excited to talk to you too.
I mean, I as James says, I read this first and sort of tucked it away in my mind because of our inevitable, or is it inevitable, our Anglo-centric perspective that we've had on things. But nevertheless, the war in the East obviously does involve the British. But we've never to get such an interesting and sort of case by case and person by person depiction of the characters, the players involved, the politics, how it unfolds, was quite extraordinary to come across, because a thing we've talked about on the podcast often is Japan's complete misapprehension of America and what America might do in the event of an attack. How did you come to the subject?
Well, I came to the subject from a completely personal perspective, because I went to American high school for the last 2 years of high school, and I was sitting in this U.S. history class, and the topic of the day was Pearl Harbor. And a classmate sort of very casually asked me, "Erri, why did you attack us?" And my initial instinct was, I didn't attack Pearl Harbor. But then I started thinking, why did Japan attack Pearl Harbor at all? I mean, it was such a lopsided war, irrational war. A country goes to war usually thinking that it has a pretty good chance of winning. Otherwise, it makes no sense. And that sort of questioning sort of was at the back of my mind when I studied history in university and international relations at the graduate level. And when it came time to write a PhD thesis, I felt that I really had to tackle some aspects of this puzzle. I didn't directly write on this, but it was sort of brewing in my mind. And about 15 years ago, I started writing it. And I think it took me maybe 6 years to really make sense of all the actors, institutions, and different motives, and also people speaking different things. I mean, the same person could be pro-war or anti-war at the same time, depending on where he is speaking or to whom he's speaking. And it made no sense. So it was a great historical puzzle that I felt that I really needed to solve in my mind for my own sanity.
Well, this was the thing that struck me when I read it. Was the point you make in the book, I think fairly early on, where you say depending on where people were speaking and who they were speaking to, they would tailor what they were saying almost completely to their audience. And so you'd have people who'd say to each other, right, that next meeting I'm going to tell them how it is, and then they'd say something completely at odds with what they said their position was, and that which is quite Johnsonian, but everyone's second guessing themselves as well as each other the entire time. So there's no wonder no one can arrive at sort of clear decisions because they're cancelling themselves out all the time.
Yes, I think that's a very accurate description of what was going on at the highest level of decision making, which is quite irresponsible because the highest decision-making circle should be debating things like war entry or occupation of southern Indochina, which was one of the big events that triggered the downward spiral in my mind. So I think coupled with that dynamic is the idea that responsibility was shared and diluted by a group of individuals, top leaders, about a handful, about maybe a dozen, depending on how you count. But my book would have been so much easier to write if the common notion of Japan being a military dictatorship or Emperor Hirohito being a dictator. It's not at all. It's too complicated for me to really explain in neat sentences. But I think one thing to remember, the first thing to remember is that Japan was formally divided into two governments at this point because of the Meiji Constitution, which allowed the military to advise the emperor, who is also the supreme commander of the armed forces, independently of the government. And the civilian government, which also included Navy and Army ministries, they can also advise and formulate policy. So, the Meiji Constitution gave this power of independence of supreme command to the military, thinking that soldiers would not meddle with politics, and they would just advise the emperor on tactical matters. But when the militarization and kind of nationalization, ultra-nationalization started happening after 1931, I think that was used as a kind of carte blanche for the military to stall government decision.
I mean, this is an interesting notion, isn't it? Because constitutions, after all, only work if people all agree on how they work. And you can have what you want in place, but if people aren't prepared to play by the supposed rules, they won't work. And that's really what's going on here, isn't it? It's that the emperor's been restored at the end of the 19th century as an institution. So you've got this, but as a sort of blank page, and they've written things onto him constitutionally, and actually then people do whatever they by 1931 they're doing whatever they want. And paying lip service to the idea of a constitution, but the checks and balances only work if people abide by them, right?
Exactly, and I mean that's true with any laws and international laws. And I mean, I'm reminded of how Japan left the League of Nations after the Manchurian incident. Yeah. Of course, they didn't want to be penalized within that forum, international forum, and that was more sort of a deep-seated or longer-term cause for the Pacific War. But it didn't really necessitate that Japan attacked the United States at that point. But of course, with the benefit of the hindsight, we know that was the beginning.
And Erri, tell us a little bit about Hirohito. And
personally, I mean, we can only guess. I mean, very few people knew him personally well enough to sort of, depict him as a kind of a person or approachable statesman or monarch. I think, but from what we can glean at, I think he was very much taken to liberal internationalism, because that's the kind of creed of the day when he was growing up. And he took a grand tour of Europe when he was turning 20 and was very much, he came back to Japan having converted to sort of British system of constitutional monarchy. And he really desired to be that kind of a ruler. Reign but not rule kind of ruler. And also he was very affected by the devastations of World War I, the battlefield that he witnessed in Belgium. So I think he was at heart pacifist, but he also knew that because his constitutional role was to be above politics, he was essentially ex machina. He shouldn't intervene politically too much. And his closest advisor tended to warn him against that too. So his role was very much conflicted. He was at once a kind of a keeper of Shintoism, sort of an animistic religion that was based on ancestral worship and all that. But then he was also supposed to embody modernity that Japan was striving for since 1868.
And this is the Meiji Revolution.
As the supreme commander.
The Meiji Restoration.
Yes, the Meiji Restoration, not revolution. Restoration from above, yes.
Wow.
So I think his role was intrinsically conflicted because he was supposed to embody modernity and Japan's ancient greatness at the same time.
Well, the other thing that struck me so clearly is that on the one hand you've got this sort of rising urban population in Japan, which is full of poets and writers and journalists and people who are going to see, cinema shows and do modern, kind of fairly Western style things to pass the time of day. And yet there's these absolute horrors going on in Shanghai and Nanking and elsewhere, and this sort of really unbelievably racist attitude to the Chinese, where they're being butchered and raped and murdered and treated as not second-class citizens, but treated like animals to the slaughter. And how does one marry those two attitudes together? It just seems completely paradoxical, really.
I think it is paradoxical, and also, to what extent that kind of brutality on the continent could be explained as a kind of a soldiers going astray and not having leadership, or no, I'm not sure. Or is it in human nature to be that way when absolutely pressed?
Well, we've seen it in Bucha, haven't we?
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. That's what I was thinking of.
There's not a massive leap, is there? But
No, unfortunately not. But also Japan was not an open democracy to the extent that, information from China was very selectively reported ever since the Manchurian incident, when Japan's field army in the northeast conquered some provinces in Manchuria, China's northeast. Yep. So the newspapers started selling more newspapers, more copies, because it sort of boosted national pride, and really it sold war in cahoot with the military. So the kind of self-censorship had already started in 1931. So there's
sort of politics. You talk about that contrast, Jim, between sort of a bourgeois life in Japan itself, and then what the army's getting up to. Are there sort of, is it fair to say there are sort of two Japans running in parallel? The militarized military one that's doing sort of making the running politically and forcing the other Japan to go along with it, or what's the overlap, and what's the sort of complicity of the other Japan in this?
Right. That's a nice way of visualizing it. I think you're right that yes, there are sort of two Japans living parallel lives, and I think the overlap might be the emperor, sort of the emperor worship that generations of Japanese by then had been, raised and sort of like religion believed in. Another aspect is this idea of Asia, self-serving idea of Asian freedom, and how Japan was to be the regional leader who'd, lead the rest of Asia out of Western imperialism and colonialism. And for the rest of Asia to be successful, they had to be more like Japan. So it's a very chauvinistic, but also paternalistic and colonialist and everything else.
And in a way American, perhaps.
Yes,
certainly a reflection of Japan's understanding of America, what America is, how American power works, what sort of American it's like a manifest destiny idea, isn't it?
Right. Yes, and also Monroe Doctrine was invoked by many Japanese nationalists and Pan-Asianists who wanted to exercise Japanese influence to the rest of the region, and they themselves really saw Japan as a preordained leader. I mean, otherwise, how do you explain the fact that it escaped colonialism and it became modern and industrialized nation in such a short time, and it won 2 modern wars, one against Jin China and the other one against Tsarist Russia.
Yeah.
White power.
Yeah, yeah.
Well, I was just going to say, I'm still sort of so intrigued by this sort of dichotomy between, Japanese troops on the eastern seaboard of China and what life is like at home. And you make this really, really important point that it's not a dictatorship. This is not totally dominating society in a way that the Nazis do, or even Mussolini's Italy, for example, or even communist Soviet Union. So your average family, in their late 30s, parents, kids, sort of, teenagers living in Tokyo, they're pretty free. They can do whatever they like, can they? I mean, there's no real restrictions on them or anything.
Yes, and I think at least in urban circles, people are getting more and more education and people reading in different languages. And the irony of the Pacific War is that towards the end of the war, of course, you know about the kamikaze pilots, the suicidal squadron. Those pilots were chosen out of often universities, the most select universities, arts and letters faculties, because they were dispensable. They were not engineers or doctors. So these pilots often wrote and, read in several languages, and including classical Chinese as well. And they were such cultivated bunch. And of course, they knew that, they were going to die, but they also wanted to die for more elevated cause than just misguided leadership. So they sort of attached deeper meaning like Asian freedom, or for the poetic beauty of, short life, sacrificing their lives for the rest of nation.
Yeah, but even so, it's still so hard to kind of get your head around that, isn't it?
Then a point you make in the book that's really interesting is that, because after all, I think an impression that we may have is that Japan's a militarized society, that you can bracket it alongside the totalitarian Nazi state, but there's much more going on than that. I really love the thing you talk about when they change the military service laws, which gradually sort of alter and adjust so that shorter and shorter people can join the army, older and older people can join the army. Your reservist duty gets longer and longer, and all these tricks that states play when they're in real trouble and they're running out of people. But then this thing you talk about, people drinking supersized bottles of soy sauce before their physical, so they get a heart murmur or heart failure or whatever, and can get out of the draft. And we're often encouraged to think of the fanatical Japanese soldier,
because just do what they're told,
Well, and also because after all, and a lot of that springs from the fact that the British and Americans, when they first ran into the Japanese, couldn't tie their own bootlaces anyway. Were astonishingly incompetent, poorly prepared, had no idea of what the Japanese army might be capable of, let alone taking into account what the terrain was like to fight in. So we have this idea of the sort of, the tough, wiry Japanese super soldier who does as he's told. But here you have people trying to get off the physical, with home remedies and all this sort of thing. And what's really fascinating about your book is it really does you pick away at that. And in your introduction you say, this isn't revisionist history. I'm not going back to Japan to excuse it. How else can we explain what's going on if we don't actually investigate it properly? If we tell ourselves stories about what Japan was like and they're not true, they're not really what's going on, we'll never learn anything. And I was so struck by that, and also the individual accounts of people being disgusted by war in China and revolted by what was going on and not wanting to get involved in the atrocities and all this sort of stuff that breaks the picture, the uniform picture we have of the Japanese soldier, and therefore Japan's appetite for war and appetite for prosecuting a war, so that there's more going on, that there are people who aren't keen. and that you have at the top an inability of people to communicate with each other about what they really think adds to the irony, really, and the paradox of what's going on.
Thank you. I hope it worked. My sort of bringing in different perspectives, but just in terms of bringing in multifaceted perspectives, I was so happy when I found that the account that was left by Soldier Yu. Because his sort of stretched military career was very much the reflection of what you just discussed, about how conscription laws get revised and manipulated. And at the ripe age of 37 or 8, he finally comes home. He saw China and he also saw Southeast Asia. So his perspective was really broad too. And I mean, that kind of common man's perspective or common soldier's perspective was so refreshing to me as I did the research. What was more dispiriting was looking at official records of conference records where nobody is owning up to anything and sort of trying to pass the buck and trying to blame somebody else, and leaders of, for instance, army leaders wanting Navy leaders to say they can't fight just because they don't want to be the only ones being publicly humiliated, having to withdraw from China, for instance. I mean, that sort of petty calculations over Japan's real national interest or its citizens' safety really baffled me and depressed me to no end. So.
And what do you think is the wellspring of that? What's making that happen? What's causing that dialectic that means that?
Right. Well, I don't want to blame it on culture. I mean, culture can explain, but it's more complicated than that. Yeah. It's the political culture that was enabled by evasiveness and kind of nuances in the language, but also it all comes down in the end to leaders not having the mettle, really.
I mean, I thought that, obviously two of the key characters are Konoe, is that how you pronounce his name?
Konoe.
And the prince, and then Tojo, of course. And these two towering figures, and yet I thought Konoe was more a dove than he seems to have been in your book, and I thought that Tojo was an out-and-out hawk without any kind of second thoughts about what he was. That's how I'd kind of sort of read into it. And again, he's a much more nuanced character, which I thought was just fascinating. I mean, really. I mean,
but then in the mix as well, people like Matsuoka who are going all over the world, sort of trying to do deals and project Japanese ideas of power, but actually he's sort of more interested in performing for people.
Yes.
And he's got this sort of feeling of an actor who literally an actor on the world stage trying to perform for everybody rather than really think about what he's doing strategically. He stumbles from situation to situation, making promises left, right and centre, signing neutrality pacts with the Soviet Union without really considering what the impact of that how that might pan out for him later and all that sort of stuff. It's really, really interesting that he's in Berlin with crowds shouting Heil Hitler, Heil Matsuoka. It's quite extraordinary. It's part of the diplomatic picture that we don't often look at in 1941 because our focus is on the sort of inevitability of Barbarossa happening in the summer of 1941 and not what's going on, what he's up to in April of that year, trying to sort of sort out Japan's relationship with the Germans, and enjoying the attention rather than anything else. I mean, he's an extraordinary character.
Yeah, I mean, Erri, could you, for those who are not familiar with these titans of Japan, the Japanese politics at the time, I mean, can you just tell us a little bit about who each of them is and the part they play in this evolving story?
Well, I don't think they're titans of Japan, especially Konoe and Tojo that were mentioned by James.
Well, all right, but major political
yes,
figures.
Major players
rather than titans.
Yes, I think major players were major players because they were weak. in my mind.
Yeah, that's
For instance,
I
Konoe.
suppose that's what I find so interesting. But yeah, I'm interrupting. Sorry.
Yes, Prince Konoe, who was maybe the leader for 3 years out of 4 years leading up to
He's the prime minister,
Pearl
isn't he?
Harbor, on and off. He's a prime minister for that duration, on and off. I mean, he forms 3 cabinets, but he was responsible for the intensification of the China War when it first spiraled out of control in the summer of 1937. He thought that it was going to be a very swift victory for Japan.
Oh, heard that one
turned
before.
out to be Japan's Vietnam War.
Yeah.
Seriously. So he's because he was such a highborn prince, he was sort of considered the second emperor. That position of prime ministership was really a step down for him.
Right.
But he was also taken to politics because he felt that he was basically a Japanese chauvinist, really espoused Marxian principles when he was in university reading philosophy, but he also loved the kind of totalitarian fascistic political style as well. So he could sway from extreme right to extreme left, but not in between. He was not a liberal
Right.
Democrat at all. So that kind of person was in charge for the 3 of the 4 years leading up to Pearl Harbor. But he was also famous for not really voicing his innermost feelings, because he was basically a kind of operator who preferred to do behind the scenes decision making and really blame others when things didn't go his way. So that's how he maximized his longevity in the top political office as well. So when it became sort of apparent belatedly to him that United States is not going to give him an opportunity to meet with Roosevelt, to have a summit meeting in the late summer, early fall of 1941, he gave up. And that's when Tojo, his army minister, is appointed the next prime minister. And he was the one who declared war. But he was also a conflicted character. He seemed
much more
always
so than I'd
gung-ho.
appreciated, I have to say.
Yeah. So the first job that he sets for himself when he was appointed prime minister by the palace is to reconsider this September 6th decision, which was about setting a deadline to diplomacy.
Yeah.
And
This is September
start
41,
mobilizing.
obviously.
September 41. So deadline of, I think, early October, deadline was set by that decision. And diplomacy is not going to take care of U.S.-Japan relations. Japan has to attack within the year because the resources to wage war is dwindling and so on and so forth. But, of course, the military was not ready to launch a war at all. So, and it's the Navy, not the Army, where Tojo was from, that had to do the bulk of the fighting. So he's really, doing this tough talk publicly, but he's so unsure. And he also knows that the palace, the emperor that he worshipped, was against war as well. So he sets for himself this series of liaison meetings between the high command and the civilian government, reconsidering different scenarios. What happens if we go to war now? What happens if we wait? What happens if we pursue diplomacy and war options in parallel? And the third option is the one that they finally adopted with a revised deadline. But it's still a short deadline because everything had to be done by the end of November, which the Washington diplomats, of course, found impossible to meet.
Yep.
Yeah. We need to take a quick break right now. We'll be back in a second. Welcome back to We Have Ways of Making You Talk with me and James. We're talking to Erri Hotta about Japan. It feels like there's this, like you say, deadlines that are impossible to meet. Is there a juncture at which that these people making these decisions in this culture, in this set of circumstances, could have come to a different conclusion and decided not to try to fight America? Or do you think, I mean, is it one of your chapters is called An Unwinnable Inevitable War. Is it inevitable? Or do you think, is there a point of no return in this Japanese trajectory? Or is there a possibility to not go ahead?
I tend to think that nothing was inevitable.
Yeah.
That there were many turning points. Even just looking at the 1 year leading up to war, I mean, why did Japan hastily sign tripartite pact with Hitler and Mussolini? And, Konoe starts regretting it. And of course, Konoe starts regretting it because he didn't quite see the ideological impact it had. I think Matsuoka was very much a, realpolitik kind of guy. He was operating on the principle of power politics and thinking that the more camp you have in your alliance, even if they were fascist powers, Washington will be intimidated enough to come to negotiating table. That was the kind of reasoning behind this triple alliance. And then, Stalin joins that kind of a loose alliance in early spring of 1941 as well. But nothing really happened as a result of that alliance making. And of course, people in Tokyo started wondering, people who knew much less about outside world. The thing about Matsuoka is that he grew up in America partly from age 13 to 22, went to University of Oregon. He spent most of the time on the West Coast. So his experience might have been different had he lived on the East Coast. But he, of course, lived through all the prejudices and kind of racial discrimination and had this weird worldview, not weird, but kind of very fixed worldview that if you are bullied, you have to fight back.
Yeah.
So that was kind of that was the underlying theme behind his kind of strong-headed, hard-nosed power political diplomacy based on basically brinksmanship.
Yeah.
And of course, people in Tokyo started wondering, Matsuoka seems to know a lot about how, public relations work and how international conferences work, but America has not come to us asking for negotiation. And this informal conversation that was started was a result of Japanese amateur diplomats and also Catholic priests on the American side, trying to establish peace between the two countries. So Matsuoka had nothing to do with it. So on the one hand, that kind of new diplomatic channel was being developed in Washington. And then here is Matsuoka, who's bombastic and kind of really a bit crazy, who has to be contained, but Konoe being really averse to open confrontation, doesn't really say, "Oh, you better resign." So he'd take months, so about 2 months, trying to make him resign. And when he felt that he couldn't do it, the whole cabinet resigned, forcing the ouster of this really unpredictable foreign minister, Matsuoka.
But obviously, one of the problems of brinkmanship is that it takes you to the brink, and it's very easy to slip over the edge of it, isn't it? And that's what's happening here. It's just there's this. Yes. I mean, I was just fascinated by this notion that everyone knows if they go to war with America and the Allies that it's a suicide mission, that there's very little chance of them ever winning, and it's going to end badly, and yet they can't help themselves. They just get sucked into this.
Yes, they get entrapped by their sort of bellicose rhetoric.
Yes.
And of course, and with the timetable embedded in that rhetoric, of course, you have to follow that timetable as a soldier. So I think it's, they really made themselves sort of believe that it was inevitable and it was kind of forced on them from the other side. But of course, you don't launch an offensive attack because the other side made you do it. I mean, it took months of planning to come up with a plan.
Would you consider Yamamoto a titan, or would you consider him just another?
I think yes. I think titan title should be reserved for Yamamoto and maybe to an extent Matsuoka, just because he did so much damage, and but he did so much damage. Both of them knew that Americans would not give up until Japan is completely crushed, and wanted to avert war.
Because Yamamoto spent a lot of time in the US, hadn't he?
Yeah.
We should just explain, he's the head of the Navy, the Japanese Imperial Navy.
Yes, he's the head of Combined Fleet, who also acted as Vice Navy Minister in the 2 years earlier, before Pearl Harbor. But because he was so politically vocal and, for instance, spoke against the Tripartite Pact, the signing of the Triple Alliance, his superiors feared for his life. So he was sort of not demoted, but he was put on a more strategic planning end of the Navy. So he was made the commander of Combined Fleet, in which capacity he had to plan for war the best he could. He was also a gambler. Matsuoka was also a gambler. Yeah. Yamamoto and Matsuoka had those risk takers kind of temperaments in common, I think. Both had open temperaments. Both were very kind of risk takers in the sense that I think they were really excited in some bizarre way by the notion that the slimmer the chance, the sweeter the victory.
Yes.
So I think they were driven by that kind of...
But that's also bonkers, isn't it?
Yes.
I mean, it's...
Especially, yes, it's bonkers.
Because that's the absolute antithesis of the Allied view, which is, as the war progresses increasingly and as their supplies go, don't risk anything unless you know you're going to win.
But Yamamoto's similar to Matsuoka in that he's putting on a performance, isn't he, as well? Because he has war injuries, doesn't he?
Right.
Right.
I almost forgot about that. Yes.
And has
you're right.
3 fingers on one of his hands.
Left hand.
And he's always trying to show that it hasn't affected him. So he learns to catch a ball with his left hand, and all this, even though he's right-handed, and all this sort of stuff, to try and not reveal his weakness or his truth about himself, and sort of puts on a display. It not dissimilar to Matsuoka. This idea that this feeds into this culture of you're never going to admit you're wrong. You're never going to admit the war's a terrible idea. Better to go to war than admit you're making a mistake, which is the most extraordinary. Yes. And you know, this isn't Japan. This happens again and again in history anyway. But he's a good bluffer, isn't he? And he's a good gambler and all this sort of stuff. And the moment you know that about him, Pearl Harbor, well, it's a gamble, isn't it? You roll the dice and you hope that you come up with sixes, and that the Americans can't answer you. And of course he doesn't roll 2 sixes. He rolls sort of 2 4s or something. I mean, at best.
You're right. And also the problem with Pearl Harbor was that, of course, with the sneak attack, you might win initial battles, but I mean, who dictates the peace? I mean, you are completely dependent on the other side to sue for peace. And Americans, as Yamamoto knew all along, would not sue for peace until they have an upper hand. So it was really premised on false kind of idealistic fantasy scenario.
Yeah. Erri, can I ask you something about sources and about where you research? I mean, I'm looking at the Shenshi Sosho, which is partly translated, which is this epic official history of Japan's war, and it goes to over 100 volumes, and I think volume 16 or something like that is Imphal and Kohima, for example. But incredibly detailed, full of lots of based on after action reports and all sorts of stuff. But I mean, where does one go? Is it, obviously in America you've got various institutions and libraries. You've got the National Archives and Records Administration. Over here we've got we've got Kew, and we've got the Imperial War Museum, and so on and so forth. I mean, where does one go to research a book like this?
Right. Because the surviving records are so limited, and the Sugiyama memorandum that I cite all the time to have a glimpse into the conferences, the proceedings, they've been published for a long time. So I could purchase how many volumes? 8 volumes of it, and just consult them. Yeah. So it was actually because I was dealing with already pre-selected materials, that part of the research, I mean, I could even sort of travel with my books and cross the Pacific and still write the book. But I think, of course, because of the things that are left unsaid in those conference memos, I had to fill in the gap. And also I wanted to bring in as many perspectives as possible. So, yes, I did random research in local libraries where my parents live in Tokyo, and sometimes came up with like a treasure, diary of a...
So there are, if one goes to Tokyo, you can dig out diaries and books and memoirs and stuff. They exist.
Yes. And all bookstores, secondhand bookstores are really, I mean, this industry hasn't died. I mean, it's diminishing, but it's still a great place to hunt for old books.
Right.
So,
and what about Soldier
and the
U?
internet, of course. Soldier U was off of the internet. I think there was a kind of an effort to bring about different recollections of war, and people. I mean, I think his family uploaded the diary after he died because they didn't know anything about his experience, but he was writing about it in his spare time towards the end of his life.
And his is one of those sources you can read and take pretty much as it is, unlike these official documents where cabinet meetings where no one is saying what they're really thinking. No one says what they're really thinking, and there's no way of ever knowing what they really think or what their intentions truly are, apart from the surface intention of trying to act like they're in agreement with each other. I mean,
yes.
Absolutely extraordinary. Yes. I mean, when you read the British cabinet papers or stuff like that, you do get some of that's going on because people are politicking, but not to such a sort of. There is disagreement. There are. There is disagreement, and people are falling out with each other. But it's, I mean, that must have been extremely difficult to try, because you're sort of trying to read the runes, aren't you? You're trying to. Yes. You need a divining rod.
And because it's a memo that was written like after the fact, and people were jotting down things from the memory of Sugiyama, the army chief, and the different people are jotting them down at different times. So it's not like, it's just not consistent. The tone is not consistent. And also there's nothing to indicate, well, sometimes a little bit, but nothing really to indicate the atmosphere of the room or what kind of table they're sitting at or anything. So I think for those, I needed to introduce memoirs and different people's diaries. But of course, these come with their own biases and prejudices as well. So.
And how's the war viewed in Japan today? I mean, it's complicated, obviously.
Well,
do we need to do another episode on that,
yes,
Erri?
I think so. I think so. I might have to write another book on that before that. Well, I think the war is viewed with regret, especially because of all the devastations that it brought Japan. People in Japan, because Japan became such an important Cold War ally to the United States, I think it's the whole devastations, even the atomic bombings tend to be seen more like a natural calamities, and peace is important, but they don't discuss how peace was to be maintained. And people might have different notions of peace. Having an active army and navy in some people's mind is keeping peace, but for many pacifists, Japanese, who grew up, 80% or 90% of Japanese population now have grown up in peacetime, and they don't want to have much to do with it. On the other hand, they are divided about the use of nuclear power as well. So I think debating is not something many Japanese have been good at or have been brought up to do. So
I'm just so struck by this notion that the kind of 275,000 Japanese troops that were posted to the Philippines in the sort of second half of 1944. There they are, and they know they've got a suicide mission. They know that their job is just hold out until they die, and they're killed in battle, or they starve, or they die of some ghastly fever. And it was the same for the people who were left abandoned on Guadalcanal. It's the same for the people on Iwo Jima. It's the same for the people on Peleliu. Which I'm due to be visiting later on this year, and sort of 12,000 troops, and I think it's something like 62 survive, taken prisoner, and everyone else is dead. And it's this sense of this sacrifice, this fact that people are willing to be sacrificed. The grotesque numbers of Japanese troops that are drowned en route to these islands they're supposed to be defending by US submarines and others. How do you sort of get your head around that? It's that sort of totality of the effort by so many Japanese young men who were sent off to their inevitable early graves. I mean, that you have no hope, and I think that's the thing that I find just so hard to get my head around. And then you're reading your book where you're it sort of becomes increasingly inevitable, but everyone knows it's going to be this terrible disaster. So there's this awful kind of sort of running to the cliff and jumping over it. And it's just this collective jumping over the cliff that it's so hard. Much of that society is caring and loving and cultured and in the extreme. And putting those two together, it's so hard in a way that I don't think it's hard to understand how people became Nazis.
Do you think it has something to do with being an island country as well?
Possibly.
That if there's no chance of defecting, and sort of if you do something that might touch the nerve of the authorities, not only you, but your family is going to be implicated. Yeah. So there's this underlying fear that if you get on the wrong side of the authorities, you and your loved ones are doomed. I think I remember the film by Clint Eastwood, not everybody's favorite, but Letters from Iwo Jima. Yeah, I thought that was a masterpiece in depicting the Japanese side of emotions and sort of nuanced, unuttered pains. And I thought that was actually one of the best war movies made from the Japanese perspective by an American.
Right. Fascinating. Because, but at the end of the war, one of the things the Japanese government is sort of trying to do is make it as expensive as possible for America to bring the war to an end, isn't it? It's that the way to get out of unconditional surrender is to make the blood price for the Americans really, really high. But in order to do that, their own blood price is utterly sort of extravagant, for want of a better word, and that's the disadvantage, of course, that starting a war by a sneak attack brings you. That you've then got to leverage yourself politically to the point where, to get a peace anything like resembling what you want, you've got to inflict as much damage as you can on the enemy. And Japan isn't in the position to do that, but still trying to do that. It's like this gambling mentality continues even to the very bitter end. And obviously the Allied powers have thought, well, we've done this once in Germany, we are absolutely not going to put ourselves through this again on the Japanese mainland. There's just no way we're going to do that. And I'm convinced that the decision to drop the atomic bombs comes from that. The Americans think, we just can't do it. We just cannot do this anymore. And they know what Japan's intentions are for drawing the war out and causing as much bloodshed as possible. And I find even articulating it difficult, because these are concepts that are so sort of monstrous in all directions that saying them out loud is almost too appalling to contemplate. Do you know what I mean?
Yes.
Yeah, I just think that the tragedy of Japan's war is just so limitless. It's so high, and I think one of the things that you've done so brilliantly, Erri, is make us consider afresh how we view the Japanese going into Second World War and the complexities, the nuance, the problems of this rapidly emerging nation coming out of the Meiji Restoration, this evolution of into sort of ultra nationalism, all these different strands that are coming in and almost sort of hurried forward, aren't they? It's like a sort of steam train kind of hurtling down the track where things are kind of outpacing the natural rate in which Japan should be developing, because one thing's happened which has then led to this thing, and then this has led to this, and this has led to Manchuria, which has then led to kind of Shanghai and Marco Polo, and suddenly it's almost as though every time there's this surge forward in events where Japan is involved, it's almost sort of out of the control of the people that are kind of supposed to be controlling it, and they can't quite keep a tab on it. And I think that's the great tragedy of it, isn't it? And tragedies come about because of flawed people, flawed personalities, and who aren't completely, I suppose the point is you're not dealing with people who are completely and totally evil, are you? It's not like Hitler, it's not like Stalin, it's much more nuanced, it's much more complex than that. And I think that makes us think about Japan in the Second World War in a different way, and that's all to be welcomed, really.
Right. Well, it's almost a comedy if you don't think that it was something that happened. Yeah. But yes.
Well, yes, because it is a comedy of manners and a comedy of errors, isn't it? That there is very much that. Interesting. You talk about being an island people. We're in this country. We're very used to saying things to each other's face that we don't mean, and the British have a reputation for being polite, or they think they have a reputation for being polite, whereas the rest of the world just thinks they're being devious and two-faced, because we say one thing and mean another. That's sort of the lingua franca of British interaction. So it's not a vast leap of imagination to see that.
Well, that's true, and that reminds me. I remember when I was at school, the deputy headmaster came up to me once and said, "I like your tie." And right. Anyway, I went, "Oh, thank you." And later on that afternoon, he said, "When I said I like your tie, what I really meant was I want you to take it off and replace it with something more appropriate immediately."
Well, there it is.
So there it is. So maybe we're not so very different.
That's very funny.
Yeah. Anyway.
That is funny.
Well, Erri, that's been it's been fantastic to get you on. Thank you so much. Thank you for your forbearance.
Pleasure. Yeah. Of course. No, it's been a pleasure.
Yes, and I recommend to our listenership that they get your book, because it's
I do too. Japan 1941, Countdown to Infamy, and it's a wonderful, startling, compellingly fascinating book that will make you rethink everything that you thought you knew about Japan in the Second World War. That's my take on it anyway.
Stick that on my dust cover.
Yeah.
Thanks everybody. Thanks Erri for joining us. Thanks everyone for listening. We'll see you again soon. Bye bye.
Cheerio.